Well, good morning. I'm Dr. Jennifer Smith, an associate professor in the economics department. My role here today is to give you a flavor of academic life in the department, to give you an idea of what your professors are like, what you'll get from your professors during your time here, and to show how you will join a thriving economics community focused on top quality teaching and research. The examples I'll give you today form just one case among many. My hugely talented and engaged colleagues on the Warwick economics staff have similar examples. I'm going to talk to you today about how my experiences in advising government on migration and the Bank of England on monetary policy and macroeconomic issues have fed into my research and my teaching. Very many of my colleagues, as I said, have similar examples of real-world influence. There are too many cases to list fully today, but I'll just give you a flavor. For example, you may have heard of Professor Oswald, whose commission on a different measure of national prosperity could have a great deal of influence on what policymakers actually aim for. My colleague, Professor Van Rens, has done influential work on food security. My colleague, Professor Novi, has done very influential work feeding into the UK and foreign governments on trade policy. My development economics colleagues work throughout the world on international and domestic development issues. The list is long. Warwick is a very impressive and inspiring place. My own experience of what might or might not be the real world started very early on. Directly after my PhD, I took a job at the Bank of England and spent 5 years at what is sometimes known as the University of Threadneedle Street. I was there when it all started, when the UK economy crashed out of the exchange rate mechanism overnight in a few hours, despite drastic measures to try and raise interest rates up to, 12% and a promise of 15%, when me and other colleagues were gathered around the coffee machines in the Bank of England, knowing that 15% was going to be completely inadequate to hold back the financial hordes who had lost belief in sterling, and thought that maybe 70, 100% interest rates were going to be needed. That was never on the cards, and the credibility of the pound was lost, so we crashed out of the exchange rate mechanism. One of the things I like to do in Warwick is to use this, and other cases I'll come to, as an example of how sometimes drastic change in policy regime is needed. I enjoy talking to my students who will go on to be future policy leaders about how sometimes a regime change is needed. Within the bank, overnight, we lost our macroeconomic policy regime. Overnight, we had to start thinking very quickly about what was going to replace it. The Treasury, the Bank of England, and even bank staff like me had a role in developing this framework very quickly. The choice of inflation targeting was an inspired one. The choice of how to design the target and retain credibility in macroeconomic policy making was a great challenge. Luckily, economics is good at providing the sort of advice that enabled the target to be designed sensibly, and also to provide an idea of how credibility could be maintained within the Bank of England. Perhaps more challenging was the uncomfortable realization that central bank transparency and the role of forecasting were going to become more important under the new regime. This was difficult for an institution like the Bank of England, which was still extremely traditional, where long lunches persisted, where the idea of having a chat with your mates about what the interest rate should be over a long lunch was a still recognized form of influencing markets. In order to persuade wage setters and price setters that the new target of 2%, or as it started, between 1% and 4%, was going to be credible, that they should set their wages and prices in line with that, a very new attitude and transparency was going to be needed. It took some months, but really, considering the regime change, it was very rapid development of the published thinking and policy framework of the Bank of England in the inflation report, the first in February 1993. This was the first time that the bank, a central bank, had set out effectively its model of inflation determination, how it thought its monetary policy affected inflation. If you look through the chapters of that first inflation report, the type of openness and the structure remains remarkably similar now in today's monetary policy reports. As I said, the other challenge, which may have been particularly specific to the Bank of England, related to forecasting. The governor of the Bank of England is appointed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who had just appointed a tax expert, Professor Mervyn King, to be the head of the monetary policy department of the Bank of England. His experience of micromanaging the tax system led him to regard the large and often intangibly related to the real world forecasting department as something alien, and he had diminished it largely in the few months before we exited the ERM. So unfortunately, this forecasting department had to be built up again, but the change enabled the forecasting department to be built differently, because as a result of the inflation targeting regime, macroeconomists actually subsequent to the policy change developed a macroeconomic theoretical framework of how interest rates, monetary policy might influence the real world growth and inflation through the monetary policy transmission mechanism, and was able to develop forecasting models in the light of that new thinking. So Mervyn's idea that the forecasting should be more theoretically based ended up being realized, despite some headaches along the way. I enjoy telling these sorts of tales to my Warwick students. It explains that policymaking isn't a perfect science, that there is scope for radical change. Sometimes radical change is a good thing, but sometimes the policy regime needs to be defended against those who wish to make radical change. I tell you, my future student decision makers, about these tales in the hope that when you go out to become policymakers, decision influencers, think tank members, and even just voters, you are going to help steer the world in a better way. So we have discussions about potential changes to policy, such as should the inflation target be raised from 2% to 3%? We discuss why that might be a good thing for growth, why it might not damage wage setting, and how it might be possible while maintaining credibility. We also discuss the perhaps deeper issue of the independence of the central bank itself. You, as future decision makers, will have an even greater challenge in this regard, probably, than we do now. The challenge comes from populists who wish to take monetary policy decision-making into democratic control and away from perhaps elitist experts who currently make policy, and also potentially from dictatorial leaders who wish to grab the levers of monetary policy for their own uses. So one of the issues that's been in the news recently is people like Javier Milei, Donald Trump, and other populist leaders wishing to abolish the independence of central banks. I've revived, because of this, models of central banking in my macroeconomic teaching to enable my students, you future leaders of the world, to understand the basis, the economic basis of why an independence for the central bank might be a good idea. The data on the chart shows empirically that it looks like, this is data for the UK, independence for the central bank post-1998 has been able to reduce the volatility of inflation, at least without harming growth. We have financial crises influencing the later era, but certainly been able to get down inflation volatility. So Javier Milei is a challenge to this, not only the empirical work that we do within Warwick Economics, but also the theoretical models that I'm able to teach in my second year course, enables my students and hopefully future policy makers to understand why the policy regime, the benefits and of the current policy regime. Now, my other policy advice role has been on the Migration Advisory Committee of the government. I was on the MAC for 8 years and was on the MAC at the time of the Brexit referendum, which was a shock. Eventually, Theresa May asked us on the MAC to devise the post-Brexit immigration regime, which was, to say the least, a challenge. The graphs show immigration, total flow inflows, and emigration outflows, and then the dark blue line here is net migration, the difference between the two. Net migration flows are still substantial. They are driven by not only policy decisions, but also importantly by economics, by economic conditions in the destination and the home country. In designing immigration policy, the MAC and the Home Office take account of economic research on the impact of migration on the labour market and on the wider economy, such as the impact on growth and productivity. My own work has fed into that somewhat. The diagram shows net migration inflows by area. And by looking at those data, we could compare the impact of migration on productivity growth or prosperity in those areas. Getting the data and devising econometric methods to do that is extremely challenging, and further work is certainly needed. But my own work, using hundreds of thousands of data points on individual firms in the UK, indicated that migration was beneficial to productivity growth. My other work with Professors Elby and Wadsworth on the impact of migration on the labour market has focused on issues such as the impact of migration on unemployment, looking at the populist idea of, do immigrants steal our jobs? We have found that that isn't true for 3 reasons. One, immigration flows are actually fairly small compared to other population flows, and other population flows such as the entry into the labour market of the baby boom generation of the mid-1960s has been at least, if not more, influential in driving labour market developments. Secondly, there is no evidence that immigrants job finding affects macroeconomic labour market variables such as unemployment. Immigrant job finding doesn't affect unemployment. And then thirdly, if you look at the variation of labour market flows over time, unemployment and amongst immigrants and natives has actually converged a great deal over time. So these are examples of research that I've done on immigration, and I've been delighted that they've been inspiring to Warwick economics students who've often taken up these ideas and actually gone forward with them in their third-year dissertations. It's been great speaking to you today about some of the research in the Warwick Economics Department, and I look forward to seeing you again.